9. Melissa Wolk. Police officers in Conway, Kentucky encountered a horror scene one morning in January 2020 when they found 55-year-old Donald Abner being mauled to death by his friend's pit bull named Denali. A 911 caller had reported hearing the dog's owner, 38-year-old Melissa Wolk, ordering Denali to attack Abner and praising the pup for obeying the command. The first officer to arrive on the scene was unable to help Abner because of how aggressive Denali was acting, giving the cop no other choice than to shoot the dog. According to a police report, Wolk was covered in blood and holding a clump of the victim's hair in her hand. She allegedly refused to stop telling Denali to attack Abner until the dog was dead, then broke down in tears while saying she went redneck on her friend. Wolk denied remembering much of the incident, citing a history of alcohol abuse and a tendency to black out while drinking. She said that Abner had been staying with her for several months at the time of the bizarre tragedy, and that she had warned him about her habit of blacking out. During questioning, Wolk appeared oddly calm and composed. She didn't seem to harbor any anger toward Abner, indicating that she had attacked him for reasons that even she couldn't explain. There were no signs of an altercation inside the house, but officers did find an empty liquor bottle. In the end, Wolk pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. 8. Jessica Hess. During a trip to the Redneck Yacht Club Park in Punta Gorda, Florida in early 2014, 19-year-old Jessica Hess saw another woman riding on an ATV with her ex-boyfriend and allegedly flew into an unprovoked rage. As Hess tried to attack the woman, a bystander attempted to intervene and quickly became the target of the young woman's explosive anger. Hess was accused of repeatedly stabbing the victim, 22-year-old Amy Rachel, in a frenzied knife attack. According to a police report, Hess plunged the 3-inch blade into Rachel's body at least 5 times and then said, "I hope you die." Many onlookers didn't even realize what had happened until they noticed that Rachel was bleeding. The young woman was airlifted to a trauma center, while Hess was taken to a nearby hospital with minor injuries. According to media reports, Hess and her ex-boyfriend had broken up about a year before the incident. The ex-boyfriend told NBC News that Hess had tried to fight every woman she'd seen him with since the breakup. She was arrested on suspicion of aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, marking one of many incidents at the park that have ended in serious injury or death. Between 2009 and 2012, at least 14 park visitors were airlifted to the emergency room, prompting some community members to call for the yacht club's closure. The park remained open, but its owner acknowledged the growing concerns and vowed to improve their safety and security measures. 7. William Cobb. Nicknamed the Redneck Robber for the stereotypical way he dressed and acted, a 43-year-old South Carolina man named William Cobb was arrested by the FBI in 2007 on suspicion of committing 40 or more bank robberies across 8 states. During his 18-month crime spree, he allegedly targeted banks in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, Tennessee, Alabama, and Kentucky. Most of the robberies were carried out in a similar fashion, with the suspect handing the teller a note demanding cash and threatening to use a weapon but not actually showing one. FBI agents linked Cobb to dozens of robberies using physical descriptions from witnesses by comparing similarities between the way the robberies were committed and through surveillance footage, which often showed the suspect peeking into the windows of a bank that he was about to rob. Cobb was captured at a convenience store in Summerville, South Carolina, after police received a report about a drunk person refusing to leave the property. A responding officer found Cobb in his car with 2 open cans of beer and a wig lying nearby. The suspect tried passing the wig off as a kinky accessory that he and his girlfriend used in the bedroom, but the officer's curiosity was piqued. And during a search of Cobb's car, the cop found a bag full of disguises, a bag of crack cocaine, $920 in cash, and several license plates. Cobb reportedly confessed to robbing as many as 90 banks and told FBI agents that he was addicted to his crime of choice. He was arrested and held without bail, and while the outcome of the case is unclear, it's likely safe to assume that he served prison time for his crimes. 6. Joshua Spencer. 51-year-old Joseph Donjan was driving with his niece and another woman in Daytona, North Florida one day in 2013 when a man flagged him down. Later identified as 43-year-old Joshua David Spencer, the man allegedly accused Donjan of doing donuts in the street, calling him a redneck, threatened to set his truck on fire, and hit him in the face with a .357 caliber pistol. One of Donjan's passengers claimed that when she said she was calling the police, Spencer pistol whipped Donjan a second time and then fired his gun into the air. Spencer gave police a much different story, claiming that he didn't even own a gun and that no altercation had taken place. He admitted to being a convicted felon, which meant that he wasn't allowed to own a firearm, and described the victims as crackheads who were trying to get him into trouble. According to a police report, Spencer's wife refused to cooperate with law enforcement, beyond telling them that there were no guns on the couple's property. A witness told a canvassing deputy that she had overheard 2 gunshots and what sounded like a truck speeding off right before the deputy arrived in the neighborhood. As a result, Spencer was charged with a slew of felonies, including aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and firing or throwing a deadly missile at a vehicle. Records show that he's currently serving a 20-year sentence at a minimum security work camp in Avon Park, with a scheduled release date of 2033. 5. Dealing meth. After becoming addicted to methamphetamine in her 40s, Lisa Dawn Wentworth got tired of waiting for her drug dealer to come through when she was in need. To overcome the issue, she and her boyfriend, Roger Dale Franklin, became street-level drug dealers for Mexico's Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generacion, a cartel that's better known as CJNG. Despite only being around for a decade or less, CJNG is one of the world's most powerful and dangerous drug operations. The organization employs people like Wentworth and Franklin, who peddle drugs in and around their community of Lenoir, North Carolina, without raising the suspicions that an outsider would. Meanwhile, the couple profited massively while feeding their addiction, building what Wentworth later described to the Courier-Journal as redneck drug dealing empire. She coined the term as a reference to the tendency for many of her and Franklin's customers to pay for their drugs with belongings rather than money. In a remote mountainous region where poverty and addiction are common, it wasn't unusual for customers to offer the couple a hot water heater, their chauffeuring services, or even their actual car in exchange for a bag of meth. Wentworth didn't know that she and Franklin were getting their drugs from a cartel, but she finally learned in 2014 after they were busted with a stash during a traffic stop for making an illegal U-turn. In exchange for her cooperation, Wentworth served a short prison sentence for conspiracy to distribute meth. She regained her freedom just a few years after the arrest in 2017. Franklin was less lucky due to his criminal history, which was factored into his punishment. He's currently serving a 40-year sentence for drug trafficking and possession of firearms. 4. Mark Thomas Watch. In late 2011, a 43-year-old Florida man named Mark Thomas Watch was accused of shooting at his lawnmower, pulling a gun on his adult son, and fighting the 18-year-old while on a drunken rampage. Martin County deputies reportedly had to tase him 3 times before they were able to take him into custody. According to an affidavit, the chaos began when Watch pulled a handgun and began complaining about his son's mother not paying child support. The son wrestled the weapon away from his father and hoped that Watch would go sleep off his drunkenness. But instead, he returned to the scene with a 12-gauge shotgun. Once again, though, the son managed to take the gun away from Watch, at which point he dialed 911. Watch allegedly told deputies that he shoots his gun outside his Palm City home all the time, and that he was just doing what rednecks do by fighting his son. He didn't seem to think it acted inappropriately, but law enforcement disagreed and arrested him on suspicion of aggravated domestic assault with a firearm and domestic battery. While the outcome of the case is unclear, records show that nobody with Watch's name is currently incarcerated or on supervised release in Florida. 3. Larry Doyle Sanders. A fishing trip between two friends along Oklahoma's South Canadian River ended in murder for the most bizarre reasons imaginable in mid-2022. 53-year-old Larry Doyle Sanders and 52-year-old Jimmy Glenn Knighton were catching catfish with their bare hands, an activity that's otherwise known as noodling, when they got into a disagreement. For reasons that may never be entirely clear, Sanders allegedly struck Knighton with a stick. A struggle ensued, and Sanders eventually strangled Knighton to death, then tossed his body in the river and went home. While being questioned by the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation about Knighton's disappearance the following day, Sanders claimed that he killed his friend because he was worried that Knighton was going to feed him to Bigfoot. According to an affidavit, Sanders thought Knighton was trying to get away from him so that the mythical beast could devour him. Unwilling to be left alone and helpless, he did what he thought he needed to do to stay safe. After admitting to the deadly violence, Sanders drew a map detailing the location of Knighton's body. He was arrested for first-degree murder and is being held at the Pontotoc County Jail pending the outcome of his case. As of August 2023, a judge has denied his motion for a speedy trial, but Sanders' attorney reportedly plans to argue an insanity defense. 2. Matthew Manard. On the night before New Year's Eve in 2012, 4 police officers were dispatched to a bar in Fort Worth, Texas called Redneck Heaven. Officers arrived at around 11 p.m. to find a man in jeans and cowboy boots in the midst of a drunken rampage. A police report described the man, 21-year-old Matthew Manard, as being extremely intoxicated. Employees accused Manard of refusing to pay his $31 bar tab and hurling beer bottles from the table he was sitting at. When officers told Manard that he was under arrest and ordered him to stand up, he allegedly refused. A brief struggle ensued as the cops took Manard to the ground and attempted to handcuff him. In the meantime, an excited crowd gathered around and got too close for comfort. After managing to get only one of the handcuffs on Manard, the police tased him. They then finally got the other cuff on him and escorted him out of the bar as he continued to resist, kicking at the officers with his cowboy boots as they tried wrestling him into leg restraints. Manard was arrested on suspicion of resisting arrest, theft of service, and public intoxication, but the outcome of the case is unclear. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear even more stories, stay tuned for some extra content that you might have missed. 1. David Robert REI. 46-year-old David Robert REI already had an extensive criminal history when he was arrested in January 2008 for allegedly hurling racial slurs at 3 Latino men and threatening them with a BB gun while they drove past his home in Westchester, Pennsylvania. One of his victims, Efren Navarrete, would later testify that he saw REI standing on the side of the street and waving at him as he and 2 of his friends drove past on their way to visit someone. REI allegedly responded by cursing at the men. Navarrete said that when he drove down the same street a little while later, REI was in the road blocking his vehicle with what looked like a gun in his hand. According to Navarrete's testimony, REI said he was sick of the number of Hispanic people living in the neighborhood and warned the victim that he had 2 seconds to get out of his face. Fearing that REI's gun was real and that he might use it, Navarrete and his friends fled the scene and called the police. During questioning, REI allegedly accused Navarrete's group of laughing and cursing at him, and he denied making any racial remarks. He would later admit that he acted asinine, but continued to deny being racist, stating that he'd never had a problem with Hispanic people, even though he was admittedly pretty much a redneck. Navarrete identified a BB gun that he'd recovered from REI's house as the weapon he recalled being threatened with during the encounter. REI was charged with simple assault, possessing an instrument of a crime, recklessly endangering another person, and prohibited offensive weapons. The prosecutor filed a charge of ethnic intimidation, but withdrew it before it got the chance to go before a court. During a bench trial, the judge found REI guilty of simple assault and possessing an instrument of a crime. The judge also acquitted him of recklessly endangering another person and prohibited offensive weapons. Despite his lengthy criminal record, REI was spared from prison time and instead was sentenced to 5 years of probation. While handing down the sentence, the judge offered the defendant some words of wisdom about how almost everyone in America has roots elsewhere, and that there's no room for REI's nonsense in a country where people should pull together.
Number 9. Rebecca Melon. The marriage between Rebecca Melon and Donald Melon Jr. came to a sudden and deadly end at their home in Phoenix in 2012. Donald was sitting on the couch talking on the phone when Rebecca approached and fired a single shot at him. She lit a cigarette as her husband lay dying. She waited 23 minutes before calling 911. Rebecca initially told police that she walked out of the bedroom and found Donald shot, but her story didn't add up, and investigators found surveillance footage and other incriminating evidence. She eventually owned up to the murder, but her attorneys argued for leniency, claiming that Donald had an extreme jealousy problem. According to Rebecca, he was abusive and controlled every aspect of her life, to the point where he wouldn't even let her have a job. Donald allegedly became even more jealous after they got married, despite his promises to change, and the reason police were able to obtain footage of the crime so easily was because the couple's house was filled with security cameras that Donald used to keep constant track of Rebecca. Regardless of her reasons for shooting Donald, the crime was premeditated, and the video helped prove it. Rebecca ultimately took a deal and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a 20-year prison sentence. The defense argued that the punishment was too harsh, but to Donald's loved ones, it was nowhere near enough. Number 8. Justin Barkley. Justin Barkley was 4 months into an LSD binge when he fatally shot a UPS driver named William Schumacher outside a Walmart in Ithaca, New York in 2016. He fled the scene, and an 8-hour standoff with law enforcement ensued, during which Barkley shot a gun in the air and ran over the victim's body with his vehicle. He later told investigators he had shot Donald Trump while in a paranoid and deluded state, and he also claimed that someone had been drugging him. The psychological effects of Barkley's drug abuse would be the crux of his defense attorney's argument in court, but his acid bender didn't get him off the hook. After undergoing a mental evaluation, the judge declared him competent to stand trial. He ultimately took a deal and pleaded guilty to manslaughter in exchange for a 25-year sentence, followed by 5 years of post-release supervision. At his sentencing, Barkley apologized to Schumacher's family and said that he wished he had gotten the help he needed instead of spiraling out of control and taking an innocent man's life. Number 7. Timothy Crook. One morning in 2007, a paranoid schizophrenic named Timothy Crook crept into his elderly parents' bedroom in Wiltshire, England, and brutally bludgeoned, strangled, and stomped them to death. He then put the bodies of 83-year-old Robert Crook and 76-year-old Elsie in the trunk of his car and dumped their remains on a property he owned 150 miles, 241 kilometers away. When concerned friends asked Crook where the couple was, he claimed they were at his property trying to sell it for him. But his story didn't sit right with them, so they reported Robert and Elsie missing. Police soon discovered the victims' bodies in some overgrowth at Crook's property. They found Crook's car abandoned near a train station and soon uncovered footage of him catching a train to London. Crook was apprehended and charged with murder. He was initially found incompetent to stand trial, but his condition eventually improved. 8 years later, the matter finally proceeded in court. During the trial, the jury heard about Crook's complicated relationship with his parents and his lengthy mental health history. Before the murder, he had lost his job and moved back in with his parents. He was supposed to be under supervision, but had failed to register with local mental health services and refused to take medication. His condition worsened while it went unmonitored. Instead of recognizing that he had committed a crime, Crook believed that the British and American governments were conspiring against him. The court found him guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility due to his mental health, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 6 years. He was given credit for the 8 years he had already served while waiting for the case to go to trial. Number 6. Heaven Bilal. In 2021, 41-year-old Heaven Bilal moved to London to be closer to her brother, 46-year-old Omar. A few months later, a neighbor heard screams coming from inside the woman's apartment and called the police. Inside, officers found Omar's body covered partially in garbage bags. They quickly discovered that he had been stabbed and decapitated, and his head was missing. The police eventually found Omar's head in a travel bag inside a bedroom wardrobe. They also noticed that Heaven's clothing was covered in blood, and it didn't take long for them to put two and two together and arrest her on suspicion of murder. Prosecutor Dwight Jones said that there was no doubt Heaven killed Omar, but acknowledged that she was in the grips of a severe mental illness when the crime occurred. Court-appointed experts agreed and told the court that the defendant suffered from delusions to the point where she didn't understand that what she did to her brother was wrong. Jones said that it was unusual for both the prosecution and the defense to recommend that jurors find a suspect not guilty by reason of insanity, but this case was a rare exception to the norm. The jury returned a verdict as recommended, and Bilal was sentenced indefinitely to a psychiatric institution. Number 5. Dwight Jones. Renowned forensic psychiatrist Stephen Pitt was fatally gunned down at his office in Scottsdale, Arizona in 2018, marking the first of 6 murders that would occur over the next 5 days. The killing spree continued the next day with the double murder of 2 paralegals at a divorce law office. It was followed by the killing of a psychologist at his office and a couple at their home. After noticing that the victims were connected with her divorce case, Connie Jones went to the police with her suspicions that her ex-husband, 56-year-old Dwight, was the killer. Dwight and Connie had gone through a contentious divorce and custody battle nearly a decade earlier. He felt wronged by the court system and by his ex, and became so consumed with bitterness that he lost his job as a truck driver and spent years living out of hotels. A few days before the first homicide, Jones waged a social media campaign in an attempt to convince people that Connie was the real abuser in their marriage. He believed that his ex-wife had conspired with psychiatrists, lawyers, and members of the judicial system to revoke his parental rights. Police tracked Dwight's whereabouts to a local hotel where they discreetly evacuated other guests with plans to apprehend the suspect. But Jones figured out what was going on and shot at officers before retreating into his room. Luckily, nobody was hurt. Jones then took his own life, bringing his convoluted campaign for justice to an end. He never faced justice for his actions, which left a trail of needless devastation and heartbreak in their wake. Number 4. Esteban Santiago. After arriving in Fort Lauderdale, Florida from Alaska in 2017, Esteban Santiago retrieved his suitcase, took it to a nearby bathroom, and loaded a gun that he had carried in his checked luggage. He exited the restroom and opened fire on travelers in one of the airport's baggage claim areas. He killed 5 people and injured 6 more by direct gunfire. Several dozen others were injured in the chaos that ensued. In the wake of the shooting, it was revealed that Santiago had served in the military and was discharged from the National Guard in 2016 for strange behavior. During that same time period, he allegedly became increasingly solitary and violent. Later that year, he showed up at an FBI office in Anchorage, claiming that an intelligence agency was controlling his mind. He also said that he was hearing voices and that someone was following him. The troubled former soldier was sent for a mental evaluation, and his handgun was taken away. After the massacre, Santiago once again told authorities that he was under mind control and claimed that the CIA had forced him to join the terrorism group ISIS. His brother Brian told the New York Times that he noticed Esteban becoming more paranoid in the time leading up to the horrific crime, and he had encouraged his brother to get help. But he was released after spending just 4 days in the hospital, and his handgun was returned to him weeks before the shooting. Santiago was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia during the court proceedings, but his condition improved with medication, and he was found competent to stand trial. To avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in federal prison without parole. Number 3. Jay Clark. 33-year-old Callan Hunter was viciously stabbed in her North London home in 2020. Her neighbor Greg Ainsworth overheard the attack, called the police, and rushed over in an attempt to help. He broke down the front door and encountered what he later described as a horror scene. Ainsworth later described seeing Hunter's partner, Jay Clark, standing over her with a knife in one hand and her hair in the other. He began dragging the victim along the floor while Ainsworth bravely shouted at him to stop and asked him what he was doing. Hunter was airlifted to a hospital where doctors miraculously managed to save her life. She had so many stab wounds to her face, back, and neck that they gave up on trying to determine the exact number after counting more than 30. While Hunter began her arduous road to recovery, authorities charged Clark with attempted murder. In the days leading up to the nearly fatal attack, Hunter had been trying to end what the court described as a toxic relationship with Clark, who had become convinced that Hunter was cheating on him. It wasn't the first time he had questioned his partner's loyalty, according to the judge overseeing the case, who described the defendant as prone to unreasonable jealousy. Clark was found guilty and received a life sentence with a minimum of 14 years. Number 2. Lon Smith. 24-year-old Lon Smith was heard screaming obscenities to himself outside his Pittsburgh apartment one afternoon in late 2020. Later that day, he followed his neighbor, Ernest Mills Jr., and the man's girlfriend as they were walking to get pizza. Smith fatally shot Mills, then fled the scene. A SWAT team took him into custody 2 days later on suspicion of murder. In the wake of the horrific crime, a disturbing history of the suspect's deteriorating mental health came to light. Smith's mother, Lonna Johnson, told Trib Live that in 2019 she received a phone call from airline employees in Chicago who were refusing to let Smith catch a connecting flight due to his strange behavior. They told Johnson that her son believed he was being kidnapped and taken to China. Smith returned to Pittsburgh, where he became even more isolated over the following months. He removed all his smoke detectors because he was convinced they had cameras in them and thought a woman on the TV was communicating to him. After finding bottles filled with urine in his apartment and noticing that he had stopped taking care of himself, Johnson made an appointment for her son to see a mental health specialist. But he never made it to the appointment, which was scheduled for the day after his neighbor's murder. Smith pleaded guilty but mentally ill to third-degree murder. At his sentencing, his lawyer, Carmen Robinson, urged for leniency, citing the defendant's untreated paranoid schizophrenia at the time of the crime. She also pointed out that Smith lived in a dangerous neighborhood and claimed that it exacerbated his perception of the danger he was in. But the judge was quick to mention how Mills ran from Smith during the shooting and how there was no reason for Smith to perceive the victim as a danger. He sentenced the defendant to 16.5 to 43 years in prison. Because Smith pleaded guilty but mentally ill, he'll be housed at a prison that is capable of accommodating his mental health needs. Number 1. Diana Avera. An Alabama woman named Diana Avera was involuntarily committed to a mental hospital after being arrested for disorderly conduct in 1982. She exchanged several letters with her family, including one where she asked them to visit her. 3 months later, they were told that she had escaped. Nobody has seen or heard from her ever since. More than 40 years after Diana's disappearance, her sister Becky Hoover told news station WKRG that Diana had a history of thinking people were following her. After being hospitalized, she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Hoover also described how her sister became zombie-like during her time at the hospital. She said that Diana was barely able to speak at times, dragged her feet when she walked, and that she was undergoing electroconvulsive shock treatments. In her letters, Diana made it clear that she wanted to get out of the hospital and back to her 2 sons. The interview came amid the family's renewed efforts to shine light on Diana's disappearance and to find out what happened to her. They don't believe that the authorities tried very hard to find her, and the missing persons report they filed back in 1982 seems to have been lost. Diana's niece, Amanda Collins, filed a new missing persons report in 2020. This time it caught the attention of Mobile County Sheriff's Detective J.T. Thornton, who admitted that the records regarding the disappearance are vague. He said that he hopes the case can be solved, but for now, Diana is still considered a missing person, and the details surrounding her case remain obscure.
Some people consider the term redneck to be an insult and a stereotype, while others proudly embrace it as a core part of their identity. What's your opinion? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.